agreements, being able to talk about them, being able to problem solve, being able to work together to come up with solutions.
So let's talk a little bit about the work of a mediator, because many people in this room will not be clear, I suspect, about what we mean when we talk about mediation.
Great.
And about being mediators. You did a very good job in a very short period of time on the BBC the other night, so maybe you could just explain to the group what it is that we do, and particularly how you go about it and what the point of it is.
Sure. My basic definition of mediation is that it is an informal conversation designed to solve a problem. So what helps a conversation solve a problem? One, it takes place in the presence of someone who is outside the problem. Meaning, if you're the one who has the problem, you're a little bit blinded by, the problem and how you've experienced it. But somebody who's outside the problem doesn't have that same perspective. Number two, it's one that's done informally. Well, the law is a very formal way of solving problems. This is very informal. We just talk, that's all. And I can say we just talk, but truthfully there is a lot that goes into the talking. So how do you want to talk about a problem? Well, if you start off by saying, what is the problem? You're going to create a context of being stuck. Because what a problem really is, what a conflict is just a place where you're stuck. So how do you get unstuck? Well, one way of doing that is by starting the conversation in a different way. Tell me a little bit about who you are. How you got to this place in your life. What it is that you really want. What's important to you. Questions like that might be helpful. Another way of approaching it is this. For example, I mediate a lot of family disputes. Here's one question that I sometimes start with. What words would you use to describe the kind of family you most want to have? What words would you use to describe the kind of family you most want to have? Somebody will say, I want a family that's honest. That's the one who feels lied to. I want a family that's respectful. That one feels disrespected. I want a family that's caring. That one feels uncared for. And now we've begun to discover what is actually taking place. That's just the first question. Second question, after these words come out, does anybody here disagree with any of those words? Nobody has ever disagreed. Everybody wants a family that's loving and respectful and honest. Why not? Of course you do. So then I say, well, great, we've reached consensus. That's the kind of family you want to have. Good. Now, are each of you prepared to begin living up to those words in this conversation we're about to have right now? And everybody stops for a second and they say yes. Of course they are. And now, do any of us have permission to stop the conversation if we start to move away from those words? If we start to become less honest, less caring, less respectful? And everybody will say yes. Great. Now let's talk. What does it mean to you to be respected? What would be some kind of behavior that someone would engage in that would show you that they respected you, right? And we begin just tackling the problem like that, and then we start reaching agreements. Well, will you agree to do that? Well, for example, in the workplace, if people say, I don't feel respected by my boss, what's something that they could do? Well, they could say hello to me when I come in the door. Are you willing to do that? Sure. Okay, write it down, right? Now we've got an agreement from the boss that the boss is going to say hello to you when you walk in the door. Now, what are you going to say in response, right? Or to the boss, what would you like her to say in response when you say hello, right? Are you willing to do that? Write that one down. And now we begin accumulating tiny little agreements, really small ones. But from those small agreements, we begin to reach larger ones. And at the end of it, we have something that people will begin to do differently.
The description you've given, or the example you've given, has been of a family situation which will be so familiar to so many of us. One of the issues which has recurred in our conversations in the past few days has been a much more significant conversation which has taken place globally, and that involves your president and the president of North Korea. And it's been very interesting to hear your take on all of that. There we have a conversation which meets none of the tests that you've just set out for families, which appears to be juvenile at best. Juvenile, with language being used which, if it was heard on the playground or in a family, we would say, hold on, stop. What is that about? What's going on with both Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un that causes them to behave in this way with apparently such great risk to millions and millions of people?
Yeah. Do you all know about Miss Marple? Okay, so I love Miss Marple, and she is, her basic approach to solving murder mysteries is to go back to her village and think of the people who are in her village, okay? So I think it's a little bit like that. It's basically all families. It's all human beings, and we may have high titles, we may have all kinds of things, but fundamentally, we're talking human behavior here. And I've mediated disputes between nation states or groups within nation states. It's still all about human beings, about people like us. So, what would you think of two people in this congregation who behaved in this way? Well, not a lot, I think. But what the difficulty, I think, is that rather than slipping into judgment, which is a way of kind of simplifying somebody who's actually pretty complex, what we want to do is to instead to understand something more deeply about what's going on below the surface. The difficulty here is that we can see that Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump are both sort of prepared to trigger a kind of nuclear exchange that would end up in the deaths of millions of people. But they don't have the courage to sit down together at a table and talk. How could that possibly be? It's just so bizarre to me. And yet, that is the truth. So, one of the difficulties is a difficulty, I think, with politics in general, which is that it creates a kind of illusion. The illusion of power. The illusion that somehow what's at stake is more important than the human beings whose lives really are the ones that are on the line here. So there are several things I think that have to happen. The first is, hopefully, somebody will step in and convince them that there is another way. We all know that there's another way. We know that nobody has sat down together and had the real conversation. And it's very difficult to make that happen between heads of nation states. I worked many years ago with doing a mediation between the Sandinista government in Nicaragua and some of the rebels who were fighting against it. And I also worked helping to design conversations in Northern Ireland between Protestants and Catholics, what that process was. And the difficulty was that if the leaders were found out by their supporters to have sat down together with the other side, they'd be shot by their own people. So you couldn't even have a conversation with the other side without creating a kind of internal division that would make it really impossible for them. So instead we had to create little go-betweens. There's an approach to conflict resolution that describes first tier, second tier, third tier approaches. So the first conversation would be between the leaders themselves. Well, if that isn't possible, you go down to the second level. The second level are the people in the various governments or outside governments like Russia or China, and try to bring them in, the United Nations. And the difficulty with the United Nations is that the mediation capacity of the United Nations is incredibly limited. In the entire world, there are exactly 8 people who are mediators for the United Nations. 8 in the world, right? This is just not enough, not even close to being enough. 800 probably would not be enough. So what do we have to do, really? We have to operate on this second level, but then there's a third level. The third level down is the heads of what we call civil society organizations, churches, professors in universities, non-profit organizations, charitable organizations, groups of people who kind of gathered together. And this was what happened with the first Israeli-Palestinian agreement. It began with this third level of connection that then reached up to the second level that finally forced the first level to come to the table. And the fourth tier is people like us. So many years ago, what I did was I started a group called, 10 years ago, a group called Mediators Beyond Borders, like Doctors Without Borders, and we go to different countries and we try to build people's conflict resolution skills, their capacity to talk to each other in constructive and productive ways. All of these have to come into play. More deeply than that is something else. And this is a problem I think that we can all see in a bunch of different areas. We see it in the US because of the election of Donald Trump and some of the things that have taken place there, but we can see it in the Korea example and in various other places. We have to rethink the way that we do politics, because politics really is just, in my view, is just social problem solving. Well, that sounds pretty good, but what's wrong with that? Well, the problem is it's social problem solving done with power, and it's something about the nature of power that makes it difficult for these conversations to happen constructively. That is actually addictive, that's blinding, that gives people the sense that somehow they are above the conditions that really govern our lives. I'm reading this little book right now. It's called It Sounded Like a Good Idea. And it's a book about history and about fundamental mistakes that were made in history that resulted in incredible shifts. And one of the ones that they talked about recently was the Spanish Armada and the defeat of the Spanish Armada by Sir Francis Drake and the English fleet, right? And the reason that they were defeated was not just because they had these boats that were kind of faster and more nimble than the Spanish Armada. The English fleet had actually run out of ammunition. The Spanish didn't know that. And so the English sent in a group of boats that they had lit on fire to destroy some of the Spanish fleet, which was successful. But the other boats made a decision. And the decision was, instead of facing the English, who they didn't know had no ammunition left, and heading back to Spain to replenish their supplies and come back and invade England from the Netherlands, which Spain owned and controlled at that time, they decided to head north and go around the north of England, around Scotland, and down past Ireland and head home. And of course, that was the decision, the fateful decision that destroyed the Spanish fleet. Well, that's an example of a place where the decision-making was concentrated in actually the person of somebody who had no naval experience whatsoever. He was a representative of the Spanish king and appointed to be in charge of this decision. And he decided not to listen to the people who really knew what this passage was going to be like, and made the wrong choice. And there are lots and lots of places where this type of thing takes place. But we also do it in families when we disregard the wishes of the members of our own family. We do it in communities where people are excluded from participating in that community. We do it in churches. We do it in lots of different places. And I think the fundamental orientation that we have to politics is to inclusion and consensus building. It doesn't mean that you never vote, it just means what we have to work on is actually reaching agreements with each other. And my experience is that in about maybe 90 to 95% of the conflicts that I work with, where 100% of the people who come to me are totally stuck and have no idea what to do, about 95% of them end up resolving their disputes.
Yeah.
How is that possible?
Let's
And
pause.
it's through this process.
Let's
Yes.
pause and pick that up.
Yeah.
We're going to wouldn't it be great just to bottle what we've just heard and just take it away? I mean, there's so much, and every time, this is the fourth event, every time Ken speaks, I hear something new myself, and I go, God, gee whiz. Anyway, even if you take 2 or 3 little nuggets away that you might be able to use in your own lives from what you've just heard, that will be of enormous value. So while Ken talks in expansive terms, we talk about what's going on in the world, remember that he keeps bringing it back to us and our families and our communities, our churches, our neighbourhoods. All of this stuff applies to you and me in this room, in our own lives, as it applies to the bigger scale political and international issues. Do remember that. And esoteric, though sometimes it may sound, it's all about people like us that you are talking. Thank you for the first half. We're going to have a very short break because there's a lot more food behind to be eaten up. Coffee cups and tea cups to be replenished. We will resume in 5 minutes, folks. All right? Thank you so far. Okay.